Greetings! I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Saint Chamond. I might be saying that wrong, but you'll just have to deal with that. This is, as the box says, a Takom kit in 1/35th scale representing a late type Saint Chamond heavy tank, and an odd looking vehicle it is. That's pretty much the entire reason I bought this kit, because it looks kinda weird. I am told that this kit is currently out of production, however, it can still be bought. I got mine from HobbyLink in Japan. I won't be showing what's in the box in this video, however if you're interested in seeing the sprues and such, I did a what's in the box video a short while ago, which surprisingly enough shows what's in the box, and there's a link in the description if you would like to go and watch that. But now I'm going to get right into the gluing together of bits of plastic. We start at the beginning, and in this case, that's with the top of the hull, which comes as a sort of tub. Often the bottom of the hull comes as a tub, and all of the detail goes on top. With this kit it's kind of reversed. Of course, that's not to say there's no detail on top. The first things I add are these support pieces, I guess you might call them. Whatever they are, they're not difficult to install. They do have mounting slots, but you've still got to kind of eyeball them and make sure they're vertical. There's 2 of these toward the rear, and 4 more toward the front. These are different parts, though they do look similar, so be sure that you're using the correct parts. Then there's another flat bit with some rivets. Or are they bolts? Whatever they are, this bit goes here, and I try to make sure that it's level with the top of the hull. Next, this thing goes here. I don't know what it's called, but this is where the muffler will sit, and it goes into place easily enough. You might have noticed that there's a bunch of openings on the roof of the hull. Can't just leave those open or you'll see that there's nothing inside. So, I add hatches. There's a variety of hatches in various sizes to suit the various holes. You can consult the instructions to figure out which hatch goes where. They all go on in pretty much the same way, you just need to line up the hinge bits with those on the hull, and then eyeball it so that the parts are sitting as straight as you can get them. Next, I build this door. You can see there's keying on the inside of each half of this, and it goes together nice and easily as you might expect. Then, why not install it? It goes here, in the obvious opening for it on the front right of the tank. I make sure there's enough glue to hold it in place, and so that the glue god will smile upon us. The other side doesn't need a door for whatever reason. Then it's time for some more roof doodads. This thing, which will go over the large section of roof, requires 2 little hatches, and these go into place much like the previous hatches. The cupola comes next, and this is a little bit fiddly. Only a little bit though, and they do have keying, which makes it a bit easier than it otherwise would be. When I had 3 walls together, I decided to attach them to the underside of the roof, just to be sure that everything was going to line up nice and neat. Then I add the final wall. I found using tweezers to get it into place was quite helpful. Once that's together, I install it on the roof of the hull, because why not? The fit wasn't quite perfect and there were some gaps, though I did my best to use pressure to eliminate them. I wasn't totally sure if the upper front plate was going to fit with this, but it's in place and we can deal with problems, if any, when they arise. Next, I add that panelly doodad with the little hatches that I put together a few moments ago. This is just as easy as it looks. How easy does it look, Herbert? Very. Gluing together the 2 halves of the exhaust muffler, or at least that's what I think this is. It could just be a combiner for the 4 exhausts, I wouldn't know. I'm no exhaust surgeon, though I do know a thing or two about being exhausted. And then it can be glued into place on that little plate with the 4 holes. The little hole for the exhaust pipe should be on the tank's right rear. Why not follow that with some exhaust pipe? This is obviously a long thin part, but it's not difficult to attach. There's a couple of points where it contacts the rest of the model, and that's obviously where the glue goes. The part should sit just above the tank's roof. Looks pretty decent if you ask me. Here's the front plate, and for those who like to ask what glue I'm using, it's there. SMS Extra Thin. I'm using it to attach these, well, I don't really know what you would call them, supports, random vertical bits. Whatever these are, there are 3 of them, and they're not too difficult to place. You just have to be careful that they're at a 90-degree angle to the plate. It is kind of easy for them to be nudged out of place, so don't do that. I think mine have ended up looking pretty neat. You can see there are holes there. Those are for the guns, which I assemble next. The main part of the gun comprises of two parts which go together pretty easily. I glued the gun together in segments, even though it's kind of short. I do this just to get a better fit that won't need any work afterwards. It did still need a little bit of work afterwards, but not too much. Just a little bit of sanding with a fine-grained sanding stick and some scraping, but it wasn't too much work to get a nice looking gun. This little front bit can then be glued into place, and there's a convenient guide knob on the back of this part. I then set that aside to work on some other things, like adding this handle, I guess you might call it, which goes on the upper left, from the tank's perspective of course, on the upper front plate. Simple enough. There are 4 machine guns on the St. Chamond, and they're all the same, though they do have different mountings. The mountings come as 2 parts, and the machine guns are sandwiched in between them. 3 of the guns will have mounts with a pin on the top for the sides and rear of the tank, and the 4th, for the front, has no pin on top, but it goes together the same way. While those are bonding, I put the main gun into its mount. This is pretty simple, and if you want the gun to move, you could avoid putting the glue on the pivot points, but I've decided, as usual, that I would prefer a stationary gun. That assembly is then attached to the rear of the front plate, with the gun obviously being slotted in through the bigger of the 2 holes. You might need to apply some pressure to get this to fit properly, but it shouldn't be too much of an issue. Next, I add the machine guns to their mounts. They've already got mounts! Well, now they get 2 mounts. There are 2 like this, which are flat, intended for the sides of the tank, and they sandwich over the gun's existing mount like so. Nice and easy. The mount for the rear goes together in pretty much the same way, it's just that the 2 outer parts are a bit different. This is so that they'll fit on the angled rear plate. The mount for the front machine gun is a lot like the main gun, a triangular brackety thing which sandwiches the gun between itself and the front plate. Again, you could leave the gun unglued and have it move, but I've chosen not to. Now seems like as good a time as any to attach the front plate to the rest of the hull. This isn't tricky, but I did need to apply some pressure to minimize the gaps as much as I could. They're not too bad here, though a little bit of filling is probably going to be needed afterwards. Next, why not install the machine guns? Well, I can think of a good reason. They're not very strong and will break easily, but this is the last chance you'll get to install them because it needs to be done from the inside. It's easy to install these, as you can see, just make sure that they're the right way up and in the right place. Now we can shoot in any direction we want. Hooray! There's a small recess, I guess you might call it, that goes over this hole in the rear plate here. This is easy enough to get into place. Then, on the sides, near the machine guns, we have these plugs, I guess. I don't know what they are. Maybe they're some sort of vision device. At any rate, they're easy enough to get into place. And that's about all we really need to do with the hull right now. We will need it a bit later when we attach it to the lower body of the tank, but that's going to be a while. The guns are pretty thin, and as I suggested earlier, easily bendable, so I would recommend setting this aside somewhere where it won't be bumped or knocked over or anything awful like that. Because now, it's time to work on the underside of the St. Chamond, starting with a wine barrel. I don't think that's a wine barrel, Herbert. I don't care what you think. This is 2 parts that go together quite easily. There is a little bit of a gap, which could easily be filled or simply hidden when we attach it to the rest of the tank. Now, the first of many bits of framework. I start by gluing this little handle into the side of this part, and by this part I mean this one and the other one. There are 2. Then a little axle part goes into this cylindrical bit. Very technical terms, I know. While cutting this off the sprue, I did happen to make a little bit of a mistake. Again, Herbert? Yep. I almost cut off the guide tab, but I only cut through most of it, so I just glued it back together. Next, onto this floor part, I glue the 2 little bits of framing I added handles to. They go here, like so. The instructions wanted all of these little bits assembled separately, and then added to the whole plate as one, but I figured doing it this way was a bit easier. This fairly wide part goes on next, and you can see how it's easier to assemble things this way than to try and kajigger those short little bits onto the wide beam. Next, I add those axle bits, one of which I damaged, but they do both go into place nice and easy. The keying is there, but it does have a bit of play to it, so I had to eyeball them a bit, but I think I got them more or less in the correct position. More bits of framing come next. This time 2 short ones that come to a point. The angle on the front of these should be pointing upwards. I don't worry too much about getting them straight at this point because in between them we place the wine barrel. Not a wine barrel! Once that's in place, I nudge the 2 supports so that they look like they're nice and straight relative to the rest of the hull. Also, I've tried to hide the gaps in the barrel with its positioning. Next, 2 more wine barrels. These are a bit more odd looking than the other one. They're probably not wine barrels, Herbert. Quiet you. You can see these have a guide pin, but there's no hole for it. There is a slight recess though, so you can see that the guide pin will hold the parts together in one direction, but you could easily slide them out of place the other direction. This is a bit odd for keying, but it works, and it's not that tricky. These 2 rollers, or whatever you want to call them, can be installed in these 2 holes here. Over the top of them goes a pair of boxes. This will both hold them in place and make it so that you can't see up and into the hull. Again, I've tried to hide the admittedly small gaps in the wheels by positioning them so that the gap is facing downwards. Onto this long boy, with an angle at one end, I add another support beam thing. There are 2 of these, one for either side of the hull, so they'll be a bit different, but they do go together the same way. Another short piece of frame goes here, and again, the instructions wanted these 2 frames connected and then added to the plate, but I think it's easier this way. Then, a series of receptacles, I guess you might call them. These will eventually hold the suspension springs. There is keying, but there's also a little bit of play in each part, and you should pay attention to the instructions to determine the correct positioning of each part. Try to get them as straight as you can. Those assemblies can then be attached to the rest of the whole bottom. It's not hard to get these into place, but you might need to apply some gap reducing pressure. Obviously do make sure that you've got them on the right way around. The pointy bit should match the pointy part of the hull centre. Speaking of the right way around, I'm about to make a mistake. Another one, Herbert! These parts with the wheel holdy bits on them, well, they should go here. Unfortunately, I'm putting them on the wrong way around here. Definitely pay better attention to the instructions than I did. I didn't notice for a while, but I did eventually rectify this problem. In the meantime, I added this piece of additional hull pointiness and wine barrel coverage, which is simple enough. I make sure all the support parts are connected to it as best I can. These angled doodads go here, and there are 8 in total, but 2 of them are slightly different. These 2 different ones should be mounted toward the front, which is the end with the 2 rollers. I found it a bit fiddly, but you should try to get them on as neatly as you can, and as close to 90 degrees to the side of the hull assembly as you can manage. The other 6 go into place pretty much the same way. They all needed a bit of nudging to various degrees, and I think I got them on fairly neatly, though I did later bump them and nudge them out of place again. Try not to do that. This axle-y part comes next, and it looks symmetrical, so it could be installed either way, though of course I could be wrong, and it could only go on one way. Either way, it wasn't difficult to install, thanks to the little recesses for it. More pieces of framework go across the width of the hull here. This also has a convenient pair of recesses to guide it. Just make sure that you get the angle around the right way. There's another pair of recesses just behind that, and you might guess that we have another support part that goes there. And you would be right, as you can probably already see. This one's a tiny bit different to the previous one, but still easy enough to place. You might think, oh my, that's a lot of stuff on the bottom of the hull, and you're right, but it's really just the beginning. There's a lot more to come. Like these. I guess they're covers for whatever mechanism drives the sprockets. Some sort of final drive, maybe? These parts have keying and are quite easy to position, and as you can see, there's one for either side. At this point I had realised the mistake I'd made with the return roller holding thing that I mentioned earlier, and I managed to rip the parts off of the model with only minimum damage, both to the model and myself. Now they're in the right place, a bit sloppy looking and certainly not straight, but they're on and they do the trick. And really they shouldn't be too visible anyway. So I add the return rollers. The simplest way I could think of to do this was to glue the return rollers onto the inner frame part, then glue the outer frame into place. And that's a fine theory. It was actually kind of fiddly to get the outer frame into place nice and neatly, though that is probably all my own doing really. A lot of the parts that it connects to were a little bit out of place, probably entirely my fault. I struggled with it, and eventually I ended up with something that I didn't hate. It's certainly not perfect, but it's okay, and it does seem to hold the return rollers where they should be held, which I guess is the main thing. This kind of thing can be hidden with mud anyway. Let's just say that it's all been bumped around and bent a bit through use. Yeah, that'll do. You always say that! Moving on, I add this disc that goes onto the axle thing we installed earlier. You can see there is a secondary axle thing that slots into the recess on the wheel and keeps the disc from rotating. Onto the outside of the disc we can mount the drive sprocket, so I guess that disc is a final drive housing of some sort. You can see that one side of the sprocket has moulding artifacts, so I put that side facing inward. Then, more frame parts. These ones go here and hold the drive sprocket in place. Obviously this is duplicated on the other side of the hull as well. Next, wheels. Idler wheels to be specific. These clip into this little mount like so. Easy enough. Though I would definitely suggest being careful with this. That part between the wheel holdy bit and the mounting is quite thin, as you can clearly see. Then we have this. This will form the lower suspension. To start, we glue the panels onto the central bar thingy, and that's not too hard as long as you're paying attention and gluing all of the parts into their correct locations. The main problem I have with this is how thin some of the parts are, and how much the entire assembly will flex and wobble. At the end here, which will hold the idler wheels, we add this set of flat bits. These are keyed and not too hard to install, just make sure they're around the right way. Because this suspension frame, whatever you want to call it, is a bit flimsy, why not add some more thin kind of flimsy parts to it? Yeah, why not? These little support parts go into place here. There are 2 at this end, and another 2 at this end. These parts are different, so try not to mix them up. Next, I tried to add the idler wheel. It has a guide knob on the flat part, but there's no corresponding hole. I could see a point under the part where I could drill it out, but instead, I figured I would just cut off the guide knob. There are still guide pins at the wheel end, so I just use those. And we end up with 2 wheels on a wibbly-wobbly framey thing. Whee! Now, why not join some flat bits of plastic together to make some more framey bits? Actually, this is going to end up being the forward inner road wheel holding thing. I know, I'm using very correct technical terms. This assembly is a little bit fiddly. There is some keying, but it is pretty easy to get the parts not quite straight. A little nudging and some gentle pressure were needed to get these together properly. Just to make things a little bit more fiddly and easy to break, let's add this. I don't know what it is. A support or something? This will go between the bottom of the hull and the suspension. I try to get this on as neatly as I can so that it should line up with the hull later, but it's kind of hard to tell if you've got it placed right. There's one of these for either side, as you might expect, and when they're together, it makes sense to add them to the suspension assembly. There's keying near the idler wheels for this, so that does make it a bit easier. I eyeball it so it looks like it's on at the right angle. The other 4 road wheel holdy bits have one of those long bar things, but no other doodads. This does make them a little bit easier to put together, but it also means you have to do a bit more eyeballing and nudging to make sure they're on at the correct angle. Adding these to the suspension assembly isn't the most tricky thing, just make sure you're putting the 2 center parts in the center, and the rear ones at the rear. Makes sense, right? A lot of people in the Twitch chat mentioned how fiddly and wobbly and easily breakable this looks, and, well, they aren't wrong. Fortunately, I somehow didn't break any of this. Now seems like a really good time for some wheels. We'll turn this pile into road wheels, and that's pretty easy to do. There are 2 distinct parts, and they get glued together like so. There is a little bit of play in the parts, so some attention does need to be paid to make sure that they're not all wobbly. I roll them along the desk to determine if they're within my personal wobbly wheel tolerance. Your tolerance may vary. Why not install those wheels? It is a little fiddly to do this, but it's not too bad, and you can do it in a couple of ways. You can glue the outer frame on, and then try to sandwich the wheels in between the frames, or you could glue the wheels into place on the inner frames, and then install the outer frame. I kind of did both ways, and both were a bit fiddly, but not the hardest thing in the world to do. It was a little bit time consuming, but eventually we have all 16 road wheels in place. I think it looks pretty interesting, though it is certainly an odd design. Odd designs is something I really like about World War I stuff. Now for something a bit more fiddly. These little tabs are installed on either side of the axle for the idler wheel, both sides front and back. So 4 of these little tabs on each side. There is keying for these, but it's still pretty fiddly to get into place, and I didn't really enjoy putting these on, nor did I enjoy the next bit, these little loops, which are meant to link up with the tabs I just installed. I guess they would be bolted together to hold the wheel assembly together, which seems pretty dodgy if you ask me. Getting this together was fiddly, obviously, and a bit frustrating, and most of it doesn't really seem to fit at all. I do appreciate the detail, but I don't appreciate the fiddliness. I guess the thing to do before this is to make sure the rest of the idler wheel parts are pressed together nice and tight, so that these U-bracket things, whatever you want to call them, will actually fit. What I've ended up with is okay, and I've made an effort to have the parts showing on the outside line up better than those on the inside, so it doesn't look too terrible, but this is the sort of thing that would be a good candidate for being covered in mud. The springs come next, and these are just solid plastic pieces. The fact these are solid makes them really easy to install. There's a variety of different parts, so make sure that you're putting the correct parts in the correct places. The instructions are pretty clear about what goes where. And that's about all we need to do with the suspension thing. It's fragile and wobbly, but it's quite nicely detailed, so I guess it's worth it. Next, I add this long thin curved part to the inside of the long angular part that will go over the tracks. It goes together easily enough, and obviously there's one of these for either side. Instead of installing those right away, I instead glue the suspension assembly to the whole bottom. It's not especially hard to get into place, but I figured it would be a good idea to add this in sections. I glue one set of springs to the upper part, hold it and let it bond, then another, and another, then another, until they are all connected. When they're all glued, I use the work surface to apply an even pressure for a bit. Then, the thin, potentially easily broken parts can be joined to the hull. This was a little bit time consuming. I had to nudge and hold most of these parts because most of them had a bit of tension in them when held in the correct position. I'm not sure how you would avoid this, other than somehow getting the parts into place perfectly with no reference. Well, I eventually got them on. You can see there's some bending, so just don't look too close under there, I guess. Tracks come next, and these are individual links that are made up of 3 parts per link. And I know that sounds kind of daunting, but there's only 36 links per side. A lot of other tanks I've built have had 80 or so it's not too bad really. Time consuming, yes, but not so bad. The first thing to do is glue the chain part, I guess you might call it. You glue the chain part with the pin on it into place. It's not too hard to get these lined up nice and neat. I do this for each link I'll need. There should be a couple left over. I feel it's important to leave these for a while so that they bond properly. That way they should have enough strength for the next step, and you'll eliminate the frustration of having them come apart. Here's the basic way they go together. Obviously this is on the end of the run and it's a bit different for the very first link, but I'm sure you can figure that out. The pin goes in through both holes on the chain part that precedes the link that you're installing. Then, this other chain part goes on like so. You'll need to apply some pressure, but not too much. It should more or less just clip together. You could probably get away with not gluing this, but I did carefully add a little bit of glue here. Obviously if you add too much you'll bond all of the links together and that's going to cause problems when you try to install the track, so do be careful. You should end up with some nice movable track links, something like this. They're not perfect, and they sort of have a twist to them so they won't just lie flat, but they're together and they look good. As far as individual track links go, I quite like these. As I said, it was quite time consuming to get them all together, and if you rush it I would expect you to have problems, but I think it was worth it. I would suggest putting these tracks together a good amount of time before you need to install them, which is what I do next. This was quite fiddly. The instructions say to leave one of the links, the plate bit of the link, the part that contacts the ground. The instructions want you to leave one of those off and then join the chain bits, but that seems a bit more fiddly. I find a place I should be able to get my fingers in to fiddle with stuff, slot the pin part in through the holes on the preceding chain, then I kajigger the loose bit of chain on the end into its place. I'm not sure my words are doing much justice here, but you should be able to see what I'm doing in the video, and that probably explains it better than my feeble words do. I nudged the links around a bit to get them to settle, and that's one set of tracks on. I think they look pretty good. They're very well detailed and interesting to look at. I have rebelled against the instructions here a bit. They say to put the tracks on at the very end. I figured the hull with its easily broken machine guns would be a bit of a hindrance to that, so I put this set of tracks on now. Unfortunately, because I didn't want to spend hours streaming myself putting together the other set of tracks, I did actually put that on at the very end after everything else was together, and it was certainly quite a lot more fiddly to do it that way. I would recommend against it. Anyway, the next thing I did was to add these, I guess you might call them Mudguards. They go here, and pressure was needed to minimise the gaps. Next, these little plates go on here, and while this isn't the hardest thing to do, the parts you press the plates onto do kind of want to flex away from it a bit, which adds a bit of a challenge, I guess. It might be a bit easier to put these on before the Mudguard things, that way you could get in behind them and brace them for pressure applying. And now, it's time to attach the upper hull to the lower hull. There are two poles in here, which I installed much earlier in the build but must have forgot to film them, and therefore forgot to talk about them in the script. I suppose it's not really an issue to leave these off until now, but they are the primary way the two halves of this model will be joined, so they should be added at some point, preferably before now. The model does slot together nice and easily. For a little bit of extra strength, it seemed like a good idea to apply some glue where the floor parts come in contact with the hull sides. I hold it for a bit, and it should stay together good and proper. The lower front plate comes next, and before putting this on the tank, there's this thing that goes in the centre like so. I tried to line this up nice and straight, but it got nudged out of place while I was installing the plate anyway, so might as well wait until it's on the model really. As you can see here, I'm installing the plate. It's not a perfect fit, and it required a fair bit of pressure and a bunch of holding while the glue bonded to get it to sit nice and neatly. The result is clearly not perfect, and a little bit of filling and maybe some trimming is going to be required before painting. On the front of that little central thingy maneuver, a shackle is installed. I used the helpful force of gravity to figure out how this should be hanging before I glue it into place. To finish the model, I attached the lower rear plate, and I would say that this is probably the worst fitting part of this kit. The way I installed it was to glue one half on, doing my best to minimise gaps, and because it's going to take a lot of pressure to force the part into something approaching a gap-free fit on the other side, I leave this half attached for a while the glue bonded properly. So by the time I got around to kajiggering the other half into place, I had long since stopped streaming. In fact, it was more than a day later. I got the part on and I did my best, but it's definitely not a good fit. You can no doubt see that at the end of the video. I also added the other set of tracks without filming it, and it was pretty fiddly, made even more so by the machine guns, or rather my not wanting to destroy the machine guns, though it would have been helpful if I was able to lay the model on its side to add the tracks. But they're on, and no guns were broken, which is nice. So, that's the Takom St Chamond in 1/35th scale completed. Again, there's no locking tab mechanism, so I apologise to those folks who really like to see that sort of thing. Despite that, I think this is a really cool looking model. It's an interesting vehicle. Probably not the best design, which might explain why you don't see many like this, but hey, it was World War I and people were still learning and iterating on designs. That's one of the things that makes that era most interesting to me. That suspension does seem kind of ridiculous. Interesting, but ridiculous. It was also the area where the most work went into this kit, which is a bit unusual. It kind of makes me want to display it with the front of the hull up in the air as though it's cresting a ridge or something. I put so much work into that suspension it would be kind of a shame for it to mostly be invisible. That would of course involve making a diorama base for it, and maybe I will do that one day. Not anytime soon, but maybe one day. For the most part, this kit was quite fun to put together. Some of the suspension was kind of annoying, though probably about half of that annoyance was caused by myself, and my mistakes. But I made the mistakes, so you don't have to. I'm very generous like that. Thank you, Herbert. You're welcome. Some of you might not agree, but I would say that the tracks were not the most annoying part of this kit. In fact, I think they were quite good. As I probably said earlier, if you take your time and you're careful, they're not really that hard to put together, just time consuming. Which, I mean, time is valuable, but I have definitely encountered more annoying tracks. I'd suggest putting them together while watching a movie or a stream. I recommend Herbert Erpaderp on Twitch. You might never have heard of him, but he's a pretty cool guy. Ha ha ha! Anyway, they are good tracks and they look quite convincing. Much better and more convincing than the dreaded rubber band tracks. Enough on that. There were some challenges in this build and it did take a fairly long time to get done, but it was still enjoyable. As I said earlier in the video, and in the What's in the Box video, I understand this model is out of production, but you can probably still find it if you really want it. Maybe one day this kit will go back into production, who knows. I'm actually kind of excited to paint this kit. I think it's a great canvas to try out that cool French camo scheme with all of the colours broken up by black line. You know the one, whatever that scheme is called. I have just bought a paint set specifically for this tank, and the Meng FT17 I recently did, so I'm going to paint both of those sooner than later. That said, I would recommend not holding your breath if you want to see both of those painted. It is going to be a while. Okay, I might be waffling a little bit. If you can find this kit, I think you'd probably enjoy it, as long as you can deal with the bad rear plate, I guess. I would certainly not recommend it to a beginner, but it shouldn't be too difficult for your average modeler. Most of the parts do fit together nicely, though there are a lot of thin and easily broken parts. Mold lines were present as always, but they weren't too bad, only minor cleanup was required. Before I paint it, I'm definitely going to have to get the putty out, but I don't think it's going to be anything too horrible. Overall, I think it's a good kit. If you've got any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the comment section below. If you want to watch me build kits like this one live on stream, head on over to my Twitch channel. The link is in the description below. If you've not already done so, why not follow or subscribe for free? Or if you have the means and you want to help me do the things I do, and see my videos a bit early, consider becoming a patron. You can find links to all of my things like Discord, Patreon and social media in the description below. And as always, I shall return soon. So, until then, be excellent to each other, have a wonderful day, and thanks for watching. Farewell.